Hey everyone, welcome to a deep dive into something I bet we all do and something that impacts every single relationship we have.
Oh, for sure.
It's selective sharing,
Right.
or filtering as some people call it.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's that dance we do, choosing what we reveal and what we keep under wraps.
Yeah.
Ever wonder if there's like a method to the madness?
Uh-huh.
We're going to find out today.
Yeah. This is fascinating because it's not about outright lies.
Right.
It's more about being strategic with what we share, and honestly, it can be a really healthy thing.
Hold on. Healthy.
Mm-hmm.
Really? I always thought honesty was the best policy,
Right.
full transparency and all that.
Mm-hmm.
This selective sharing or filtering source material you gave me
Yeah.
has some surprising stuff about the benefits of selective sharing.
It's true. Think about it this way. You wouldn't tell your partner every tiny detail of your workday, right?
No.
Some things just aren't relevant.
Right.
And too much information can be overwhelming.
Yeah.
That's selective sharing in action.
Right.
And it helps maintain those boundaries that are so crucial in any relationship.
Okay, that makes sense. But the source also mentions respecting boundaries.
Yeah.
And I have to admit, I'm a little fuzzy on what that looks like in practice.
Okay. Well, picture that we all have our own personal bubbles, right?
Yeah.
Some folks are really comfortable sharing everything, while others are much more private. By being mindful of what we share, we show respect for those individual comfort levels.
So it's not just about protecting ourselves.
No.
It's also about being sensitive to the other person's needs.
Absolutely. There's a really interesting concept called communication privacy management theory that explores this.
Okay.
It highlights how we each have different rules about what information we consider private
Okay.
and who we're willing to share it with.
So how do we figure out those boundaries? It seems like a recipe for disaster if we're all guessing what the other person is comfortable with.
You're right. Clear communication is key.
Yeah.
It's about having open conversations about what feels okay to share.
And what feels off limits.
Right.
And remember, these boundaries can change over time.
Right.
So checking in regularly is really important.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this selective sharing thing can be good. The source material also talks about emotional safety. Is that related to boundaries?
Definitely. Imagine feeling like you have to walk on eggshells all the time,
Uh-huh.
afraid to share anything for fear of judgment.
Right.
Selective sharing helps create a space where vulnerability is possible without feeling completely exposed.
So it's not about hiding things.
Right?
It's about choosing what to share to create a safe space for both people.
Exactly. And this ties into something called attachment theory,
Okay.
which looks at how our early relationships shape our patterns later in life.
Okay.
Securely attached folks tend to be better at finding that sweet spot between openness
Right.
and protecting themselves, which is key for healthy selective sharing.
This is making me rethink everything I thought I knew about honesty.
There's so much more to it than just blurting out every thought that pops into our heads.
Right. It's more about being strategic and understanding that different situations call for different approaches. Sometimes a little bit of filtering can actually strengthen the relationship.
Okay, so filtering can be good,
Right.
but isn't there a risk of taking it too far?
Oh, yeah.
When does it become a problem?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
And it's something we definitely need to explore. Selective sharing or filtering highlights some risks that we should be aware of.
Okay,
Like when withholding information starts to erode trust.
that makes sense. If you're constantly keeping secrets or hiding things from your partner,
Mm-hmm.
it's bound to create problems eventually.
Think about it this way. A healthy relationship is built on a foundation of trust.
Right.
When we selectively share information, we're essentially making a judgment call about what will strengthen
Yeah.
or weaken that foundation.
So how do we know if we're making the right call? It seems like there's a fine line between protecting the relationship and just being plain deceptive.
It definitely requires careful consideration and honest self-reflection. Are you withholding information to protect yourself,
Right.
or are you genuinely trying to protect the relationship?
That's a good question to ask ourselves.
Yeah.
Is there anything else we should be looking out for?
Well, another risk to be aware of is emotional disconnect.
Okay.
If you're constantly filtering what you share, it can prevent genuine connection. Imagine trying to build a house without any bricks, right? You need those raw materials, those honest interactions to create a solid foundation.
So too much filtering can actually lead to a weaker bond,
Yes.
even if you think you're doing it for the right reasons.
Exactly. And then there's miscommunication.
Right.
Think about it. If you're only telling part of the story,
Yeah.
it can lead to all sorts of misunderstandings and conflicts down the line.
Uh-huh.
It's like trying to solve a puzzle with half the pieces missing.
So we have to be careful not to create more problems than we're solving with all this selective sharing. How do we find that balance? It seems like every relationship has its own set of challenges and nuances.
You're absolutely right. There's no one-size-fits-all answer. It's
Really?
about navigating those gray areas,
Yeah.
being mindful of the specific dynamics of each relationship. But there are some strategies that can help. One strategy that can be really helpful is to regularly check in with yourself about your motivations for withholding information. Are you doing it to protect the relationship, or are you avoiding a tough conversation?
Like we were talking about earlier, are we protecting the relationship or just ourselves? It's hard to be honest with ourselves sometimes.
It is tough. But think about it this way. Sometimes those uncomfortable conversations are exactly what's needed to build a stronger connection. Avoiding them might seem easier in the moment, but it can create bigger issues down the road.
So it's about thinking long term. Like, how will this decision affect the relationship a year from now, 5 years from now?
Exactly. It's about weighing the potential consequences of our actions. And another thing, clear and open communication with your partner is so important. Talk about your expectations around sharing what feels comfortable and what doesn't.
That's a good point. Different people have different comfort levels with privacy, and sometimes we just assume our partner knows how we fear without actually talking about it.
Right. And that's where those misunderstandings can creep in. It's like we each have our own instruction manual for sharing, but we forget to give a copy to the other person.
So we need to share those manuals, have those conversations about what works for each of us. It's almost like relationship preventative maintenance, right?
Yeah,
Dealing with small issues now to avoid bigger problems later.
that's a great analogy. And this is where things get really interesting because sometimes not sharing can actually become a moral issue.
Wait, really? I thought we were talking about healthy relationships here, not ethics class.
Selective sharing or filtering brings up a really thought-provoking example. Let's say you hear someone making negative comments about a friend behind their back. Do you stay silent to avoid conflict, or do you speak up to defend your friend?
Ooh, that's a tough one. I can see how both choices could have consequences, and it's hard to know what's the right thing to do. What does the source recommend?
It really depends on the situation. Sometimes confronting the issue directly is necessary to protect someone from harm. Other times it might be more appropriate to focus on supporting the person who's being talked about.
So it's about considering the bigger picture and trying to figure out what will do the least amount of damage.
Exactly. And remember, we're not always going to get it right, but being aware of these ethical considerations can help us make more thoughtful choices.
Okay, so we've covered a lot about the benefits and risks of selective sharing, and even how not sharing can be a problem. It feels like a real balancing act. How do we even know if we're striking the right balance in our own relationships?
You know, there's no magic formula. But one way to gauge this is by looking at the overall health of the relationship.
Like if there's a lot of trust and open communication, it's probably a good sign that things are working.
Exactly. But if there's constant conflict, resentment, or a feeling of distance, it might be a signal to reevaluate how you're approaching selective sharing.
So we need to pay attention to those warning signs. But what about those times when we're not sure what to do? You know, those gray areas where it's not clear-cut whether to share or not.
Those are tough, for sure. But even then, there are things we can do. Like, think about the long-term implications of your choice. Will withholding this information ultimately help or hurt the relationship?
So it's about taking a step back and looking at the bigger picture, not just focusing on how we feel in the moment.
Right. It's about making conscious choices that align with our values and the kind of relationships we want to build.
This whole deep dive has really made me think about how I communicate. It's amazing how something as simple as choosing what to share can have such a profound impact on our relationships.
It really can, and it's something we can all work on. Remember, communication is a skill, and like any skill, it takes practice and intention.
So we've talked a lot about how to selectively share, but what about the flip side? What about receiving information from others, especially when they're choosing to filter what they tell us?
That's a great point, and it brings up another layer of complexity, because even when we're on the receiving end of selective sharing, we still have a responsibility to communicate effectively.
What do you mean? I feel like if someone's not being open with me, there's not much I can do about it.
Well, you can start by setting clear expectations for yourself. It's okay to let your loved ones know that you value honesty and open communication.
So it's not about demanding that they share everything, but rather letting them know that you're a safe space for them to be vulnerable.
Exactly. And remember, sometimes people filter information because they're afraid of our reaction.
So we can actually encourage more openness by creating a judgment-free zone.
Right. And that goes back to the idea of emotional safety we talked about earlier. When people feel secure and accepted, they're more likely to share their true selves.
This whole thing is making me rethink how I approach conversations with the people I care about.
It's about shifting our mindset from what information do I need to extract from this person to how can I create a space where they feel comfortable sharing what's truly important.
That's such a powerful reframing.
Mhm.
It's not about interrogation. It's about connection.
Exactly. And even when someone is choosing to filter what they share, we can still practice active listening and try to understand their perspective.
Okay, so active listening, that's about paying attention to both the words and the nonverbal cues, right? Trying to read between the lines and pick up on what's not being said.
Exactly. And it's also about asking clarifying questions and reflecting back what you've heard to make sure you're understanding them correctly. Sometimes just feeling heard and understood can encourage someone to open up more.
It's like we're building a bridge of trust, one conversation at a time. And that bridge can lead to deeper, more authentic connections.
You got it. And remember, even in the closest relationships, there will be times when people choose to filter what they share. It's not always a sign of deception or lack of trust. Sometimes it's simply a way of protecting themselves or navigating a difficult situation.
It sounds like the key is to approach those situations with empathy and understanding.
Yeah.
To give people the benefit of the doubt and assume they have their reasons, even if we don't fully understand them.
You're absolutely right. And that's a perfect segue into another important aspect of selective sharing, the difference between filtering and keeping secrets.
Wait, there's a difference. I thought they were basically the same thing.
Not quite. While both involve withholding information, the underlying motivations and the impact on the relationship can be vastly different.
Okay, so let's unpack this whole filtering versus secrecy thing.
Okay.
How can we tell the difference?
Well, one key distinction is intention.
Okay.
With filtering. The goal is usually to protect the relationship,
Right.
maintain boundaries,
Right.
or just avoid unnecessary negativity. But with secrecy, there's often an element of deception or manipulation involved.
So if you're keeping a secret, you're probably doing it for selfish reasons,
Uh-huh.
like to avoid getting in trouble or to
Right.
protect your own image.
It's not always that cut and dry.
Okay.
But generally, secrecy tends to be motivated by fear, shame, or guilt.
Mm.
It's about hiding something that you believe could damage the relationship if it were to come out.
So it's less about protecting the other person
Yeah,
and more about protecting yourself.
exactly. And that's where the impact on the relationship comes in.
Okay.
Secrets have a way of eroding trust
Right.
and creating distance between people.
Yeah.
It's like a crack in the foundation of the relationship that can widen over time.
Whereas filtering is more about choosing your battles right,
Yeah.
deciding what information is truly essential for the other person to know
Mm-hmm.
and what can be left unsaid.
That's a good way to put it. It's about being thoughtful and intentional with your communication
Right.
rather than being driven by fear or shame.
So how do we know if we're crossing the line from healthy filtering into secrecy territory?
Mm-hmm.
Are there any red flags we should be looking out for?
One red flag is if you find yourself constantly justifying your actions
Right.
or making excuses for why you're not being fully open with someone.
Like if you're always saying things like, oh, they wouldn't understand, or
Right.
it's not a big deal.
Exactly. Another red flag is if you're withholding information that could have a significant impact on the relationship
Yeah.
or on the other person's well-being.
So for example, if you're facing a major life change like a job loss
Mm-hmm.
or a health issue, it's probably not something you want to keep secret from your partner.
Right. In those situations, honesty and transparency are crucial, even if it's difficult.
This whole conversation is making me realize just how complex communication can be. It's not just about the words we say, but also about our intentions, our fears,
Yeah.
and the unspoken dynamics between people.
You hit the nail on the head. It's a delicate dance, and it takes practice and constant awareness to get it right. But I truly believe that by understanding the nuances of selective sharing, we can build stronger, more authentic relationships.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here.
Yeah.
We've talked about the benefits and risks of selective sharing,
Yes.
those tricky ethical dilemmas, and even the difference between filtering and keeping secrets. But where do we go from here? How do we take all of this information and actually apply it to our own lives?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Well, I think the first step is to simply be more aware.
Okay.
Pay attention to your own communication patterns.
Mm-hmm.
Notice when you're choosing to share or withhold information, and ask yourself why. What are your motivations?
Right.
What are the potential consequences of your choice?
So basically become a selective sharing detective Analyze those motives.
Exactly. And once you've become more aware of your own tendencies, you can start to make more conscious choices about how you communicate.
What about those times when we're on the receiving end of selective sharing? What can we do to encourage more openness and honesty from the people in our lives?
Well, first and foremost, create a safe space for vulnerability. Let your loved ones know that you value honesty and that you're there to listen without judgment.
So
Yeah.
basically, be the kind of person you'd want to confide in. Lead by example, right?
Absolutely. And remember, sometimes people need a little encouragement to open up. Don't be afraid to ask gentle, probing questions to show that you're genuinely interested in what they have to say.
But what if they still choose to filter what they share? I mean, we can't force people to tell us everything.
You're right, we can't control other people's choices, but we can control how we respond to them. Instead of getting frustrated or defensive, try to approach the situation with empathy and understanding.
So even if someone's not being completely transparent, we can still choose to respond in a way that strengthens the relationship.
Precisely. It's about recognizing that everyone has their own reasons for filtering information.
Yeah.
And sometimes those reasons are valid.
It sounds like the key takeaway here is that selective sharing, when done mindfully and with good intentions, can actually be a positive force in our relationships.
I couldn't agree more. It's about finding that delicate balance between honesty and compassion, between protecting ourselves and nurturing our connections with others.
And remember, this journey of communication and connection is ongoing. It's something we'll be navigating for the rest of our lives. The important thing is to keep learning, keep growing, and keep striving to build relationships that are built on trust, respect, and genuine understanding.
Well said. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into selective sharing. It's been a pleasure exploring these ideas with you.
And to our listeners, we hope you found this conversation as enlightening as we have. If you're interested in learning more about this fascinating topic, we encourage you to check out the source material, Selective Sharing or Filtering, for a deeper dive. Until next time, keep those conversations flowing and those relationships